The town of Maplewood was quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew your name, your children's names, and probably the color of your curtains. It was the sort of town where nothing ever happened until Ethan Parker arrived. He drove a modest gray sedan, the kind that didn't draw attention, but from the moment he stepped out of his car with a polite nod to the mailman and a wave to the curious neighbors, it was clear that Ethan had a way of inserting himself into the rhythm of everyday life without causing a ripple. He smiled with the kind of warmth that made strangers instantly like him, his eyes bright but calculating. Maplewood had never seen him before, and yet he had the uncanny ability to make it feel as if he had always belonged. Ethan bought the small brick house at the corner of Elm Street, one of the few homes on the market in the otherwise static suburb. From the start, he became an exemplary neighbor. He carried groceries for Mrs. Whitman, the elderly woman next door, even though she protested with a laugh that he didn't need to. He helped his next-door neighbor fix a leaky faucet, volunteering advice that sounded helpful and sincere. Within a week, he had been invited to the town's annual barbecue, and by the end of the month, he had joined the local book club, despite never having read half the books they discussed. But Ethan was meticulous. Beneath his courteous smiles and friendly chatter was a man who watched everything. He memorized schedules, noticing which neighbors left for work early, who walked their dogs at exactly 7:15 a.m., and who tended to forget to lock their doors at night. Every gesture, every pattern was data. Every conversation was observed and filed away. The first death came almost naturally, almost invisibly. Mrs. Whitman, who had welcomed Ethan's help with open arms, was found the next morning in her kitchen. She had slipped, the coroner said, the sort of accident that could happen to anyone her age. No one suspected foul play. But Ethan had been there the morning before. He had helped her with groceries, rearranged her living room to suit her comfort, and left a little early, waving goodbye with a friendly grin. In his car, he allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. He had been careful. Everything appeared ordinary. To anyone else, it would look like a neighbor simply lending a hand. To him, it had been effortless precision. Ethan's charm made him invisible. People in Maplewood were busy with their routines. Children went to school, parents commuted to work, and neighbors gossiping over fences missed the small, subtle signals that could have tipped them off. Ethan knew that fear could be planted with the smallest suggestion, a casual remark here, a look there, and yet he never needed to. The town had no reason to suspect him. No one ever suspects the smiling man who carries groceries and asks after your mother's health. At the community barbecue, he positioned himself perfectly in the crowd, moving seamlessly from one conversation to another. He laughed at jokes, complimented the grill master on the perfectly seared burgers, and even offered to refill drinks for the children. All the while, his mind worked like a machine. He noted the places where cameras might be installed, the houses with doors that didn't lock, the neighbors who were home alone most days. He calculated and cataloged, a predator disguised as the perfect citizen. Detective Claire Reynolds was new to Maplewood, having transferred from the city precinct just 3 months prior. She had a keen eye for patterns that didn't belong, and the death of Mrs. Whitman, though ruled an accident, caught her attention. Something about the timing, about the way Ethan had been unusually attentive to her in the days prior, made her instincts tingle. But at this point she had no evidence, only a sense that someone was hiding in plain sight, moving among the innocent. Meanwhile, Ethan had already shifted his attention. The first kill had been a test, a small measure to remind himself that he could act without consequence. Now he began scouting his next target, a middle-aged man named Harold, who lived alone and worked night shifts at the local factory. Harold's routines were predictable, almost too predictable, and Ethan made mental notes. He observed Harold leaving his house at exactly 11:30 p.m. on weekdays, returning by 7 a.m., and always keeping his bedroom window slightly ajar. Perfect. Ethan's life was a balance of ordinary and deadly. He made appearances at the town's soccer matches, asked after neighbors' pets, and even volunteered at the library. To the world, he was Maplewood's ideal citizen, a friendly, reliable man who could be trusted without question. But behind closed doors, he refined his plans with obsessive care. He studied maps of the town, walked the streets at night, and practiced timing for his movements, always imagining the perfect execution of his crimes. He was careful to leave nothing behind, no fingerprints, no traces of violence. Each death, each disappearance would be attributed to chance, to accident, to the cruel randomness of life. He had no interest in trophies, no need for recognition. He thrived in anonymity. The town never suspected because they had no reason to. Late at night, after the town had gone silent, Ethan sat in his living room, the soft glow of a desk lamp illuminating pages filled with notes, sketches, and observations. Each neighbor had a profile, complete with habits, weaknesses, and routines. He smiled to himself, not of cruelty, but satisfaction. He was perfect at this, invisible, unnoticed, untouchable. As part one closes, Ethan leaves his house for a late-night walk. He passes by the scene of his first accident, the home of Mrs. Whitman, now quiet and empty. A passerby might see a friendly man strolling through the streets, waving to a neighbor, perhaps even humming a tune, but the audience knows the truth. This smiling stranger is a predator, a meticulous killer who has made hiding in plain sight an art form. And somewhere in the shadows of Maplewood, Detective Reynolds begins to sense that the ordinary faces around her might conceal something much more sinister. Ethan disappears around the corner, blending effortlessly with the darkness. The town sleeps, unaware that danger has already settled in, masked by charm, warmth, and the simple illusion of normalcy. The game has only begun. The town of Maplewood woke to its usual calm, unaware that beneath the surface, something malevolent was moving. Ethan Parker's friendly facade remained flawless. To neighbors, he was the reliable man next door, helping with lawn work, offering to pick up groceries, and chatting about the weather with a warmth that made even the grumpiest resident soften. No one questioned him, no one suspected him. Detective Claire Reynolds, however, could feel the subtle pulse of something wrong. 3 deaths in as many months, all seemingly accidental, all connected by Ethan's presence. Mrs. Whitman had slipped in her kitchen. Then there had been Harold, whose heart attack came suspiciously during a brief visit from Ethan. And finally, a young woman named Marisa, who fell down a staircase at the library while Ethan happened to be shelving books nearby. The coroner's reports were inconclusive, the town unconcerned, but Reynolds' instinct screamed, patterns do not lie. Ethan knew she was looking. He could feel it, an intangible tension in the air, a change in the way people moved, glanced, whispered. He studied her the way he studied everyone else, discreetly, calculating every habit. Reynolds arrived at the library shortly after Marisa's death, asking questions, observing the scene with a quiet intensity. Ethan offered a comforting smile as he overheard her conversation with the librarian. "Such a terrible accident," he said softly, his hand briefly touching the edge of the counter. "It's hard to believe something like this could happen here." To Reynolds, Ethan seemed genuine. He fit the part of the helpful citizen perfectly. But his eyes betrayed a subtle misalignment, a flicker, a hesitation, the smallest crack in his persona that made her gut tighten. She noted the detail in her notebook, though she couldn't articulate it fully. Something was off. Ethan returned home, a smile still in place, but his mind was already in motion. He began studying potential targets, mapping routines, and identifying vulnerabilities. Every interaction he had during the day was cataloged, the way neighbors left their windows open, the timing of their walks, who had security cameras and who did not. He even noted Detective Reynolds' arrival times at various locations, piecing together a subtle map of her investigation habits. Late that evening, Ethan visited Harold's empty apartment, carefully inspecting the scene. He moved quietly, checking small details to ensure no evidence could link back to him. It was a ritual, a careful dance of observation and preparation. Each movement was deliberate, each decision calculated to maintain the illusion of normalcy. He left behind nothing, no fingerprints, no trace, no evidence, just the careful arrangement of items to suggest life was uninterrupted. Meanwhile, Reynolds pored over the files. She began connecting the dots, location, timing, and the subtle presence of a common factor, Ethan Parker. But linking him to any crime was impossible. There were no witnesses, no forensic evidence, nothing to suggest malice. Still, she began creating a psychological profile, trying to anticipate what he might do next. The tension was palpable. The audience could see her reasoning unfold, while Ethan, completely unaware of her growing suspicion, continued to operate in the open. Ethan's next target was carefully chosen, a single mother named Claire Jensen, who worked late shifts at the hospital and often left her apartment door unlocked. He observed her nightly routine from a distance, making mental notes, the time she left, the streets she walked, the neighbors she passed without noticing him. He smiled to himself. The perfect opportunity would come soon. But Ethan was meticulous. He didn't strike immediately. The thrill wasn't in the kill itself, but in the planning, in the quiet power of being invisible. He attended the book club, laughed at jokes, helped clean up after meetings, and returned home each night with the careful demeanor of a man who had done nothing but live an ordinary life. To the outside world, Maplewood remained untouched by evil. Tension escalates further when Reynolds begins visiting the neighborhoods at night, observing activity, trying to catch what she suspects but cannot yet see. Ethan notices her shadowing a few blocks away while walking under streetlights. He adjusts his pattern, ensuring his next move is untraceable. In a chilling display of foresight, he even leaves false clues, minor inconsistencies that would mislead investigators without ever revealing his presence. One night, Reynolds stands outside Maurice's library, revisiting the accident scene, mentally retracing steps. She senses she is being observed, but can't pinpoint by whom. The audience sees Ethan crouched behind a hedge across the street, his eyes trained on her, not with malice but with curiosity, a predator studying the hunter. He smiles faintly, noting the timing of her steps, the rhythm of her breath, the movement of her notebook pen. Every detail was a building block for his next act. Meanwhile, Maplewood's residents continue their routines, blissfully unaware. Children play in yards, neighbors chat over fences, and the town's life carries on under the shadow of someone who walks among them. Ethan thrives in this illusion. He relishes the irony. The closer someone believes in their safety, the more vulnerable they are. His confidence grows with each unnoticed step, each perfectly executed observation. Tension peaks when Reynolds begins questioning people connected to the victims. She asks if anyone noticed unusual behavior, strange visits, or odd coincidences. Almost everyone mentions Ethan, but in passing, praising his kindness, noting his friendliness, his helpfulness. The audience sees the dramatic irony. The person under suspicion is exactly the one everyone trusts most. Ethan continues his routine, blending seamlessly with daily life. He attends the local soccer game, greets neighbors warmly, and even helps set up chairs for a community event. But at night, he sharpens his strategy. He keeps journals, sketches layouts, and writes down every detail about people's lives, habits, and vulnerabilities. He is always 2 steps ahead, always invisible, always prepared. The part ends with Ethan on his nightly walk, the cool night air brushing against his face. He passes the streetlights, nodding to neighbors who wave back, oblivious to the danger in their midst. Detective Reynolds watches from her car across the street, piecing together patterns, suspecting a presence she cannot yet confirm. Ethan senses her attention, but does not falter. He smiles, a predator in plain sight. The final image lingers, Ethan walking through the streets of Maplewood, blending perfectly, invisible yet ever present, while Reynolds begins the painstaking work of uncovering his web. Suspense tightens. The audience knows what the town does not. The killer is already planning his next move, and the hunt has only just begun. Maplewood had changed, though most residents didn't notice. The town still hummed with life, the laughter of children, the hum of traffic, the casual chatter over fences. But beneath the surface, tension had begun to thread itself through the streets. Something unseen was moving, watching, waiting. Detective Claire Reynolds felt it in her gut every time she walked the quiet roads, checked the files, or retraced the last known steps of the victims. Each death, Mrs. Whitman, Harold, Marissa, had a pattern, subtle but unmistakable, and each time Ethan Parker had been there. Ethan, meanwhile, thrived in the game of shadows. He moved through the town like a ghost, unseen and untouchable, always 3 steps ahead of anyone who might suspect. His friendly smiles never faltered. His small acts of kindness kept him anchored in the town's perception as a harmless, even admirable neighbor. But behind those smiles, his mind worked like a predator plotting chess moves years in advance. His next target was a young woman named Claire Jensen, a single mother who worked long shifts at the hospital. Her routine was predictable. She left her apartment at 7:30 p.m., walked briskly to the bus stop, and returned at 5:45 a.m., exhausted and preoccupied. Ethan studied her from the shadows, learning which neighbors were awake late, which cameras monitored the streets, and the gaps in the patrol patterns of the local police. He noted every variable, anticipating every potential disruption. Ethan's killings had become an art form of invisibility. He learned to move without being seen, to create alibis with near-perfect timing, and to manipulate perception so that suspicion would never land on him. A neighbor who saw him in the wrong place at the wrong time was gently redirected by his charm. A neighbor who almost noticed his surveillance equipment was subtly misled with casual conversation. Every step was measured, every movement deliberate. Detective Reynolds, however, was closing in. She had begun to assemble a psychological profile of the killer, meticulous, socially adept, patient, and invisible in plain sight. She realized the killer wasn't a stranger. It was someone Maplewood trusted, someone whose friendliness masked a meticulous darkness. But Reynolds lacked the smoking gun. Every time she thought she had caught a clue, Ethan had already erased it, leaving behind nothing but shadows. Tension spiked one evening when Reynolds decided to stake out the neighborhood, parked across the street from Ethan's house. She watched the lights, the doors, the windows, waiting for him to make a move. From her vantage point, she could see Ethan leave his home, strolling casually down the street, nodding to neighbors who waved back without suspicion. He moved with such ordinary grace that anyone else would have thought he was simply taking an evening walk. But Reynolds' trained eyes picked up on subtle anomalies, the way he paused briefly by a window, the slight hesitation in his gait, the precise timing of his steps. She felt the thrill of proximity to the truth, but also the frustration of invisibility. Meanwhile, Ethan had noticed her presence. He could feel the subtle attention, like a shadow at the edge of his vision. He adjusted his pattern accordingly, pretending to jog past while circling back quietly, creating a trail designed to mislead. He left small, deliberate inconsistencies for her to notice, pieces of a puzzle that would draw her attention in the wrong direction. It was psychological warfare, and he was patient enough to play it out over weeks. In Maplewood, the ripple effects of Ethan's actions began to emerge. Neighbors whispered about strange occurrences, a missing tat, a door left unlocked, shadows flickering past windows. Fear was subtle but present. The town still trusted Ethan, still laughed at his jokes, but there was a growing undercurrent of unease. People didn't know what to fear, only that something felt off. Ethan understood this instinctively. Suspicion, unformed and vague, worked in his favor. It made people nervous, distracted, and more likely to overlook the true threat. Ethan's confidence reached its peak during a late-night visit to Claire Jensen's apartment. He approached her building under the cover of darkness, careful to avoid cameras and the faint lights of other apartments. Every step had been rehearsed in his mind: entry, observation, exit. He paused at the stairwell, listening for movement, noting the slight creak of a step that could betray him. The thrill of control coursed through him. But even a master of invisibility can make a small mistake. As Ethan moved through the building, Reynolds' intuition led her to the same apartment complex. She had been tracking his likely targets, analyzing behavior patterns, and predicting where he might strike next. The scene was set, two forces moving in parallel, unaware of the imminent convergence. Ethan entered Claire's apartment quietly, ensuring everything appeared normal. He staged objects, creating the illusion that nothing was amiss, and observed the patterns he had memorized. In the shadows, he almost didn't notice Reynolds' reflection in the window across the street. A chill ran through him, a subtle, almost imperceptible awareness that the hunter was closing in, but he maintained his calm, his mask of normalcy intact. The tension of the cat-and-mouse game escalated further when Reynolds parked nearby, watching, taking notes, and attempting to predict his next move. She couldn't see him directly, but she sensed his presence, felt the threads of control he had over the environment. Every movement of Ethan's was a message to her, precise, deliberate, and taunting. Ethan left Claire's apartment without incident, blending into the night. To anyone passing by, he was just a man walking home, whistling softly, enjoying the quiet of Maplewood. But Reynolds' eyes never left him, the weight of suspicion heavy in her chest. The audience sees both sides, the predator and the investigator, moving through a shared space of tension and anticipation. By the end of Part 3, the stakes have never been higher. Ethan has mastered the art of invisibility, leaving a trail of deaths and near misses that no one can piece together. Reynolds is closing in, her mind racing to connect the dots, aware that the killer is someone no one would suspect. The town remains unaware, caught in the invisible web spun by a man who hides in plain sight. The part closes on a chilling note. Ethan walks through the empty streets, passing streetlights that cast long shadows. He smiles faintly, aware of Reynolds' pursuit, confident in his ability to remain unseen, but a tiny crack in his perfect composure hints that even the master can be challenged. The audience is left on edge, the hunter and the hunted are converging, and the final act promises confrontation, revelation, and a dramatic unmasking. Maplewood's nights had grown heavy with unspoken tension. Even the familiar streets felt different, quieter, sharper, as if the town itself held its breath. Detective Claire Reynolds had spent countless hours poring over the patterns, retracing the footsteps of the victims, and mapping every interaction Ethan Parker had in the town. Each file, each notation was a thread connecting the dots, revealing a terrifying possibility. The friendly, helpful neighbor, the one everyone smiled at, was the monster hiding in plain sight. Ethan, as always, moved through the town seamlessly. To anyone watching, he was the same amiable neighbor, opening doors for the elderly, assisting at the community center, waving warmly to passersby. But tonight, he felt the subtle pull of Reynolds' presence like a pulse beneath the skin. He had planned every detail, rehearsed every move, yet the thrill of her pursuit added a sharp edge to his otherwise perfect control. His next target was Claire Jensen once again. The single mother's routine was predictable, and the opportunity for precision was ideal. Ethan had watched her from the shadows for days, memorized the locks, timed her departure, and calculated a flawless execution. Everything depended on absolute invisibility. The night was still, moonlight barely breaking through the clouds, the streets empty save for him and the distant glow of streetlights. Meanwhile, Reynolds had anticipated this move. Her hunches, patterns, and years of instinct told her that Ethan would strike here. She parked her car across the street from Jensen's apartment complex, the engine off, notebook and camera ready, every sense alert. She had observed him in person, caught him in minor inconsistencies, and now knew with a terrible certainty that the man Maplewood trusted was capable of cold, deliberate murder. Ethan slipped inside the building, moving silently up the stairwell. Every step was calculated, deliberate, rehearsed. He paused at Jensen's door, listening. He could hear her soft breathing inside, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the settling creak of her apartment. The predator in him relished the perfection of control. For a brief moment, he smiled, thinking of how easy it would be. But then he noticed it. A shadow across the street, movement, a car parked just far enough to be hidden, but the light reflecting off the window caught the edge of her silhouette. Reynolds, the hunter, had anticipated his move. Ethan's heart, usually steady and unflinching, felt the faintest thrum of tension. He adjusted immediately, creating a diversion with a subtle shift of light, a faint knock on a neighbor's door, anything to mislead. Inside, Reynolds watched him through her binoculars, adrenaline coursing, heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. She couldn't risk a direct confrontation, not yet. She had to wait for him to make a mistake, and with her knowledge of his patterns, she knew the time was coming. Ethan completed his diversion, unaware that Reynolds had seen through it, her mind racing. She followed the movement, predicting his next step. Every choice Ethan made, calculated and deliberate, only revealed more of his character, his routines, his weaknesses. The cat-and-mouse game had reached its crescendo, and the town remained oblivious. Finally, Ethan entered Jensen's apartment. He moved through the rooms, checking locks, confirming the layout, preparing for what he believed would be an effortless act. He paused in the living room, listening to the faint sound of someone outside, the distant click of Reynolds' camera, the whisper of tires on asphalt. His mind raced through contingencies, analyzing escape routes, calculating probabilities. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty passed through him. Reynolds, positioned strategically, waited for him to make the smallest error. And he did. A faint reflection from a window, a slightly misaligned shadow, a step taken too quickly. In that fraction of a second, she had the evidence she needed, a direct link between him and the previous victim's patterns. Ethan turned, finally noticing her presence fully. His calm, unflappable demeanor faltered. Not panic, not fear, but the recognition that someone had anticipated him. His mask of perfect friendliness slipped just enough for Reynolds to see the cold, calculating predator beneath. The quiet, smiling neighbor was gone. "Ethan Parker," Reynolds called, her voice low, steady, commanding. "Step away from the apartment." Ethan's eyes flicked around, scanning for exits, for escape, for options. For years, he had controlled the environment around him, shaped perceptions, erased traces, and yet now he faced someone who could anticipate him, who could see him clearly. He tried to maintain composure, smiling faintly, but the weight of inevitability pressed down. "Detective," he said calmly, almost conversationally, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Reynolds didn't flinch. "We both know there's no misunderstanding, Ethan. I know what you've done. Step away or it will get worse for you." The tension was unbearable, the streets outside Maplewood eerily silent, as if the town itself waited for the confrontation to conclude. Ethan took a calculated step back, realizing he was trapped, not by force, but by intelligence, observation, and planning superior to his own. He had underestimated Reynolds, as meticulous as he thought he was. A brief, tense standoff followed. Ethan's mind raced. Options, contingencies, escape routes, psychological tactics. Reynolds remained steady, watching his eyes, reading his micro-expressions, waiting for him to give any sign of violence. The predator and the hunter locked in a silent duel, each aware of the other's capability. Finally, Ethan realized the game was over. He lowered his hands slightly, the faintest trace of resignation passing over his faces. The charm, the friendly smiles, the mask of normalcy all collapsed into a hollow, chilling stare. "I suppose I underestimated you," he murmured, almost admiringly. Reynolds stepped closer, handcuffs in her grasp, and Ethan allowed himself to be restrained. The predator in plain sight had been caught, not through brute force or luck, but by intellect, observation, and perseverance superior to his. Maplewood would never look at him the same way again. The aftermath was shocking for the town. Neighbors who had laughed with him, trusted him, invited him into their homes were forced to confront a terrifying truth. The smiling man who carried groceries, offered advice, and helped with minor chores was capable of cold, calculated murder. Reynolds debriefed, detailing a meticulous planning, the psychological manipulation, and the horrifying invisibility Ethan had achieved. The town reeled, grappling with the knowledge that someone could hide such darkness behind friendliness. Yet the final scene left a lingering unease. In his briefcase, found during the arrest, were notebooks filled with plans, targets, and patterns. There were gaps, escape routes unaccounted for, contingencies Reynolds hadn't yet deciphered. Ethan Parker had been caught, but his brilliance, his foresight, suggested a chilling possibility. What if this was only the beginning? The story closed with Maplewood asleep once more, unaware that darkness could wear a smile, that a friendly face could mask horror, and that even the most ordinary places could harbor extraordinary evil. Detective Reynolds reflected on the case, her mind racing through every pattern, every calculation, every subtle detail that had allowed a killer to hide in plain sight. And somewhere in the shadows of Maplewood, even as Ethan Parker was led away, the audience felt the lingering truth. Evil can be ordinary, it can be invisible, and it can strike when least expected.